Good morning. It remains remarkable that a divided, distrusting, and often dysfunctional political system was able to fashion such a complex, if imperfect, response to the crisis. And that success raises the question of how today's even more fractured and contentious system might respond should a comparable crisis occur. Those two sentences are a direct quote from John Lawrence, one of our panelists later today, in a recent piece just in the last week that he did at The Atlantic, which captures not only the policy complexity of the 2008-2009 crisis, but the political complexity of it. And that's what we're here to look at today. As I drove up from Charlottesville yesterday, I wondered whether the three presidents who regularly made that same trip, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, wondered the same thing in the face of one crisis or another. As we hear in John's terrific piece, the various political leaders staring into the abyss and speaking of meltdowns, we wonder, is that a recurring theme in American politics, and is it one that we also face today and into the future? Since the nation's founding, our political leaders have looked to history as a guide, but not just to history, but also to what has worked and not worked elsewhere, and to the contemporary reality of economics and policy. So today, we have worked very closely, very hard for a year and a half with Brookings in designing this event that brings together practitioners, historians, economists, lawyers, and political scientists to look at the full dimensions of the 2008-2009 crisis. We're honored to co-host this event with our colleagues across UVA at the Darden School of Business, the UVA Law School, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Batten School of Public Policy, and many colleagues at the Miller Center, and here at Brookings working with the Governance Studies Program and the Hutchins Center for Fiscal and Monetary Policy. And it's, for me, a personal pleasure to be back, having spent a decade here, including during the 2008-2009 crisis, with some of the best minds in the field. But we're not just looking back for history's sake. We're delighted to join forces to ask truly relevant questions for today. Are we prepared to handle the inevitable next crisis? Given economic uncertainty and political uncertainty and that potentially dangerous combination, do we have the wherewithal to address a crisis? And given the political uncertainty and economic uncertainty that's currently in the political system, where will we go next? Today's work builds on ongoing research at UVA, at the Miller Center, across these other schools, as well as ongoing research here at Brookings. The leader on our side has been Bob Bruner, who will chair the discussion later on today, two discussions later on today. He first highlighted this issue a year and a half ago. He's been a scholar of financial crises, and he sent me up here to reach out to David Wessel, who will chair our first discussion, to see what was going on here, given that at least one of the main players of the crisis, Ben Bernanke, was here at Brookings. And so I'm really delighted that we've been able to work collaboratively with David on this. In September of this year, David and his colleagues hosted a terrific two-day seminar in this room and across this building that was timed to the 10th anniversary, and today's event was planned to be the third day of that, looking at the politics of the crisis. Hurricane Florence had something else to say about that, and so today is a rescheduling of that. But that puts us 10 years ago now is the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. And so those conversations will feature prominently, including in this first panel. We are delighted to have with us Peter Orszag, who at the time of the transition and into the first part of the Obama administration served as the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Prior to that, he had been the director of the Congressional Budget Office, and prior to that, a senior fellow and the director of the Hamilton Project here at Brookings. And prior to that, working in the Clinton administration, and I was honored to get to work with Peter in several of those different iterations. And he will be interviewed by David Wessel, who is the director of the Hutchins Center for Fiscal and Monetary Policy here, a longtime journalist with the Wall Street Journal. And as I reminded David in the room right before we came here, David was the one that told me that the Miller Center job was open through his friend Alan Murray, who serves on our governing council. So David, thank you for that. And finally, my last thanks to friends and colleagues at the Miller Center who have worked very hard to put this together. Stephanie, Howard, Tom, Sakib, Alfred, Reed, and Karen, and also our governing council, many of whom are here today. I see Steve and Claire and Alice and Anne, and I know a few others are probably going to join us too. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to David and Peter, and thank you all so much for coming.
I have a request of the audience. My experience at Brookings is that when we have events like this and we use microphones like this, that people tend to talk like this. And then it makes it hard for people who are watching online to hear. So everybody in the room has a responsibility to remind the speakers as the day goes on. It's okay to speak with one hand, but you can't speak with two hands if you're using a handheld mic. I'm really pleased to be here with Peter Orszag, who Bill has quite well introduced. I just want to frame we're going to talk a little bit, not about the bailout of the banks, but about the fiscal policies that played such an important role in getting us out of the worst financial crisis in generations. But the fiscal response to the Great Recession really started when President Bush signed into law the Economic Stimulus Act on February 13, 2008, and it ended, at least in Jason Furman's mind, when the payroll tax cut enacted under President Obama expired at the end of 2012. There are several stages of this. The first stage was the Bush tax rebates. The second stage was the very big and significant Recovery Act under the Obama administration. And then the third stage, which gets a little less attention, is a number of smaller things that add up to a lot that happened later in the Obama years. So Peter, I thought it might be useful is to think about what was going through your head in January 2009, when the President Obama is in the transition. It looks like the bottom is falling out of the economy. What is going on then, and particularly, what do you know now that you didn't know then?
Thank you. First of all, let me just say it's great to be back at Brookings. Look, we knew we were in a boatload of trouble, but the reality has turned out to be much worse than was known at the time. So if you look, for example, the advance estimate of GDP growth in the fourth quarter of 2008, which was the most recent reading, if I remember correctly, it was minus 3.5%, so a 3.5% decline. The revised numbers, the final revision, it was minus 8.4, I believe. So the economy, we knew it was bad. We didn't know it was as bad as it.
So the advance, you don't mean a forecast, you mean the Bureau of Economic Analysis first cut at the numbers.
First cut. So we were, it was clear things were bad, but the fact of the matter is the reality was much worse than was known at the time. But that's the minor part that kind of relative to what we know now. What we know now, which was not as dominant in the official macroeconometric models at the time, was that the recovery would not be V-shaped. If you looked at, for example, the Congressional Budget Office forecasts from September 2008, which were, again, the most recent that we had available to us while we were trying to sort through this stuff, those projected an unemployment rate for 2012 of under 5%. Instead, the unemployment rate turned out to be over 8%. And you can see this replicated in model after model. What was happening was the formal macroeconometric models at the Federal Reserve, at the Congressional Budget Office, the ones that the economic team at the White House used also, were treating the housing bust as if it were a repeat of the 2000-2001 IT bust, because the loss of wealth initially was about the same. But those are actually, we now know, and we perhaps should have known at the time, I'll come back to that in a second, those are fundamentally different things, because the IT bust losses were spread across basically equity markets, so very diversified, whereas the housing bust losses were concentrated in highly levered financial institutions with a much different trajectory. So what's the lesson from that? I think the lesson from that is if the model that you're using for projections leaves out, as all these models did, they basically didn't have the financial sector built into them. If the model leaves out something that is core to what's driving the current problem, don't trust the model. And the second lesson is when you're designing interventions to try to offset what's happening, take uncertainty into account much more than we did. And we could come back to how you could have done that, but there would have been lots of ways to try to design things so that the stimulus continued as long as the unemployment rate was above X. That could have been done at a relatively low cost at the time because the official scorers didn't think the economy was going to remain in a bad place for so long.
Going into the crisis, though, in that time, economists had convinced themselves that discretionary fiscal policy wasn't really the right remedy, that we could trust the Federal Reserve to steer the economy away from booms and away from recessions. And the trouble with fiscal policy is that it just moves too slowly, and that it never, by the time you do it, the recovery is already well entrenched. It seems to me one lesson, there are two lessons from this crisis for that. One is, and I'd like you to talk about this, you can move pretty fast on fiscal policy. So I'd like you to talk about how that happened. And secondly, of course, if you don't have a V-shaped recovery, it's really good to have some fiscal stimulus, even if it doesn't all show up on Tuesday.
Absolutely. So on the first point, yeah, historically, if you looked at the sort of introductory macro textbooks, the argument typically was that discretionary fiscal policy takes too long to get through Congress, but then once it's enacted, it works pretty quickly, whereas monetary policy can be changed, implemented quickly, but its so-called outside lag, its effects once it's implemented on the economy are long and variable. That's the kind of cliched take on fiscal and monetary policy. We knew that going in. So our goal was not to dilly-dally and have 6 or 9 months of debate over the form of this stimulus, but rather to do it really quickly. And if my memory is correct, the final vote was like February 10th or 11th. I mean, it was remarkably fast for a piece of legislation this big. And that reflected the focus that we had during the transition, working with the Congress, and I know John Lawrence and others will talk about this later, but it required, therefore, picking those things that would work, but that would also not slow down the train. So I think it's well known that we would have preferred a lot more state fiscal relief, so more direct relief to states, but it was also clear we had maxed out the amount of such relief that we could get through Congress without it becoming an existential debate over the relative role of the federal government and the state and local government. So we said, okay, that's fine, because we knew that it was more important just to get going. And so I do think the two things that often are not noted enough about the stimulus is, one, just how quickly that
Right, it was signed into law February 17th.
February 17th, which is remarkably fast. And then secondly, that, and maybe we'll turn to this later, but that in the implementation, one of the biggest concerns was when you're spending that much money that quickly, fraud is going to be rampant. And there basically was, with very, very few exceptions, almost no fraud in the way that the stimulus actually worked in implementation. So enacted quickly and then implemented without a lot of fraud are the two, I think, untold stories of the stimulus.
So as you and I were talking before, there's an incredible amount of revisionist history. Some people who say that it's obvious that the Obama stimulus wasn't big enough were the people who were writing op-eds saying we needed a $300 billion stimulus, and you got something close to $800 billion. But why wasn't it bigger? There were people inside the administration, Christina Romer, Larry Summers, who were telling the president, this is worse than we thought, you really should go bigger, you know. What's the constraint on going bigger?
What's that Hamilton song, You Don't Have the Votes? I think it's pretty simple. But there's another dimension to this, because some people have complained that don't just blame congressional dynamics. You could have pushed harder and what have you. By the way, I think that is revisionist history. There were more than 50 blue dogs in the House. The vote in the Senate.
Define blue dogs.
Blue dogs were conservative Democrats who, frankly, were not going to go for. I had to spend a lot of time convincing, working with our friends on the Hill, convincing that coalition of Democrats to actually go along with the Democratic Party. And there were more than 10 Democrats, I think 11, who didn't wind up voting for the stimulus, in part because they thought it was too big, disproportionately from that group. In the Senate, it was even more challenging because we had a razor thin. The split was 60 Democrats, 40 Republicans. You needed 60 to pass this legislation, so it was a razor thin thing, and we just did not have enough leverage to make it that much bigger. But the more important thing, I think, is the problem with the stimulus, I think, is misframed. The problem was not how much stimulus was delivered in the second quarter of 2010. It was $120 billion or more in that quarter. It was a massive amount of stimulus. The problem was how little was delivered in the second quarter of 2012, which was approximately $10 billion. So this comes back to this kind of V-shaped thing because, again, the issue was not the flow of money during the first few quarters. It was pretty substantial, 3 to 4% of GDP. The problem was how quickly it trailed off. And that did reflect a concern. I remember the internal discussion as well. One of the things that was a criterion for being included is the phrase "no tails." So there wouldn't be a tail of spending that would go out, into 2012, 13, 14. In retrospect, that clearly was a mistake.
So couldn't you, and I think you have talked about this some, the solution was not to put a lot of money in for year 3 and 4. The solution was to build some kind of triggers that if the unemployment rate remains high, then you don't have to go back to Congress to get an extension of unemployment benefits and so forth, right?
Right, and there's a broader theme here, which is especially in today's polarized political environment in which the sclerotic nature of Congress becomes even more dominant, is to try to do more in the overall theme of automatic stabilizers, where things kick in automatically in response to economic conditions. So we could have, the tax credits. There were a whole variety of provisions in the stimulus that you could have tied to the unemployment rate. And the way that would have been evaluated at the time is the Congressional Budget Office would have said there's some probability the unemployment rate will be above 7% in 2012. But again, as I mentioned before, their central forecast was, I think, 4.8 or 4.9% unemployment in 2012. So they would have assigned a very low chance that the unemployment rate would have been over 7%. And so you would have been paying, I'm making this up, 5 or 10% at most on the dollar for any, expected
You're talking
cost.
about, because CBO didn't anticipate unemployment being 10%, they wouldn't have scored it as if it was 10%. So you wouldn't have had to pay for it in the Congressional Budget Office sense, right?
Correct. And that's the way to kind of, when this, another Machiavellian lesson here is if the official scorers are underestimating the severity of the recession, put in a lot of automatic stabilizers because it's not going to cost you that much. And then ex post, the size of the stimulus will be whatever it turns out to be, which will be much larger than what the estimates predicated on that more optimistic forecast had suggested.
I know that there were a couple of things that you thought about.
Playing budget games.
Yeah. Well, you didn't exactly invent them. I just wondered if you could talk about a couple of things that I know were considered but you didn't pursue. And here I'm drawing from the piece that Jason Furman did for the conference that Bill mentioned earlier. One was some kind of tax credit that if you hire people, add to your workforce, we give you a tax credit. Another was somehow federally funding a state sales tax holiday. And the third was giving everybody a debit card and saying if you don't use it in the 90 days, it goes up in smoke.
Yeah. So many of those fall into the category that I mentioned earlier of interesting but may take too long to legislate, and we don't have a lot of time here, folks. So let's start getting some water on the fire immediately, rather than worrying about whether adding something to the water is going to make it somewhat more effective. So let's just, as one example, take the idea of creating a tax credit for hiring. The classic problem in that kind of situation, or with that idea, is that a tax credit for any new hires, or is that a tax credit for new hires above some baseline, so that you're only getting the marginal new hires and you're not buying out the base of what firms would have done anyway? If you're fired and then rehired, does that count? And so on and so on and so on. And so you quickly go down this kind of black hole of policy design that, even though it sounds attractive, we want to reduce the cost of new hires, so let's create a tax incentive for hiring new people. In the implementation, it can become challenging. And so there were a lot of things that were considered, including that, and then we generally went for simplicity whenever possible.
Reed Hunt, who was a member of the transition team and then chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, has a book coming out that he doesn't seem to see you as the hero of the 2009 thing. He says that Obama always stood for inclusion, tolerance, and unity. He worked hard and acted with integrity, stood for high-minded principles. He was ill-served, however, by the neoliberals and Clinton advisors he chose for his transition team in powerful posts. They diverted his attention from the dramatic changes in healthcare infrastructure, innovation in clean energy, and education reform that he had promised during the campaign. In fact, Hunt's proposal for infrastructure overhaul involving clean energy generation and new transmission networks was summarily rejected by Orszag, Summers, and Geithner. Obama could have achieved a robust recovery by spurring private investment in such proposals. Instead of instituting bold changes, he allowed the rich to get richer while the economically oppressed voted for Trump. Guilty or innocent?
Yes, President Trump is my personal fault. Let me try to break this down a little bit. First, people do forget. I'll make 3 points. The first point is there actually was a bunch of structural stuff in the stimulus that seems to kind of, again, also fade from memory. And I'll point to 2 things in particular. One is the High-Tech Act, which created subsidies and then penalties for hospitals and doctors to adopt electronic health records. That was part of the stimulus. The result of that is pretty much every doctor intervention or interaction that you have today is digital, and it is causing, I spend a lot of my time in healthcare, it is a necessary but not sufficient thing to cause a lot of change in the healthcare sector. For example, if you want to examine why Dr. A is performing differently than Dr. B even in the same hospital, if your records are not digital, that analysis is very hard because you've got to take all the paper records, put them into something that can be analyzed, and then do the analysis. Today, it's a lot easier to do that. That came from the stimulus, not from the health bill. Second area is clean energy, which is where Reed appears to be focused. There was $80 to $90 billion of support for clean energy in the stimulus. Last year, 18% of U.S. energy production, domestic energy production, came from renewables. That's roughly 50% higher than before the stimulus. And experts in the field will argue correctly, in my opinion, that the support that the stimulus provided was absolutely essential to that growth in 2 ways. One was the investment in some of the technologies through the Department of Energy and ARPA-E and the other things that were done. But just as importantly, the same liquidity problems that were creating difficulties for the economy overall infected the tax credit and other markets, basically the markets for financing these kinds of these forms of energy during 2008 and 2009. And the tax credits that were provided as part of the stimulus opened the gates to continued financing of those projects. If we had gone 2, 3, 4 years with a shutdown of new projects in those fields, we would not be where we are today. So that's the first point. There was a lot of stuff. Second, with regard to the specific idea that apparently some people were obsessed with, which was to run high voltage lines from the Dakotas to the population centers like in Chicago, really cool idea. Would have loved to do it. It makes a lot of sense. We can take wind energy from where the wind is to where the people live. That's fabulous. Here's the problem. There's a lot of people that live between the Dakotas and Chicago, and to run the lines, you've got to have some form of eminent domain where you just say, guess what, guys? We're going to be putting down some high voltage lines where your house is right now. And the federal government did not have that authority. We would have had to go literally state by state, town by town to get permission, or create a new federal law to just allow you to preempt state and local laws. So this is a great example of where that would have consumed 6, 9, 12 months of legislative time, even if you could get it done. I'm not sure you could have even gotten it done. So it sounds great in theory, but in practice, the bill would not have been enacted in February if it included that. And that brings me to my final point. The most important structural change that could be made to the economy circa 2007 or 8 had to do with healthcare. And if we had consumed ourselves with getting the stimulus bill perfect and transforming the economy through that, it would have taken so much time that not only would you have not been providing the macro relief that the economy needed urgently in February, March, April, I also think you would not have gotten healthcare reform done. And so you really need to think of those two things kind of together, because the healthcare reform, I can tell you out in the field, and I know it doesn't often come across in the kind of Excel corridor, is transforming the way healthcare is delivered. There's still tons more to be done, but it is succeeding beyond my wildest imagination in terms of changing the way hospital executives and others in the field view what they do, and therefore is a massive structural reform to the economy. So I think there is a lot of revisionist history going on here, but we were in the middle of fighting a fire. We wanted to get the water on the fire as quickly as possible, and we still got a bunch of structural reform into that legislation and then followed up with the most important structural reform that I think could have happened within approximately a year.
I take that as a plea of innocence.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's think about, we're going to have another recession. Some people think it'll be soon in 2019 or 2020. I don't think they have a clue. But so let's think about where we are now. We have not strengthened the automatic stabilizers. We haven't put in any of these triggers. We have a lot more debt than we did that you inherited. The debt to GDP ratio was around 35% when President Obama was elected. It's about 78% now and getting bigger by the minute. Well, maybe not in the minute because we're not paying government employees, but the Federal Reserve, the terminal Federal Reserve Fed funds rate might be as high as 3%, so they're going to have a lot less wiggle room. What would you advise, what are the risks that we face if we hit another recession in the near term? And what do we do about them? Electronic medical records?
Yeah. Look, a couple of things. You're absolutely right that if we were to experience another recession, certainly anything of the type that or of the same magnitude that we lived through before, we're in a boatload more trouble today. And that's, I think, mostly because in the intervening period, the political system has become even more polarized. So I wouldn't worry so much about the debt to GDP ratio if there were broad political consensus that we can do a lot more stimulus if the economy turns down and then balance it with some back-end fiscal discipline, which I'll come back to in a second. The problem is you're not going to get that agreement. So we're going to if we hit a recession, the squabbling that you see over funding the government now is not going to evaporate. And that's the fundamental problem, not the economic.
I mean, is the problem that they won't do stimulus because they can't agree on anything? Or is the problem that they'll do so much and they still won't deal with the back end and we'll end up with a big debt to GDP?
Oh, no, I think the problem is disproportionately likely to be that we won't do very much stimulus, or we'll do, almost all revenue-based stimulus that's somewhat less effective, although more effective than the previous literature had suggested, but still less effective than the spending stuff. And on the back-ended fiscal discipline, if we had political consensus, people poo-poo the idea that you can put in place today things that take effect in the future and that they'll actually stick. And I think the history of that is actually more promising than people realize, so that you could actually spend $100 today and promise to cut spending or raise taxes by $100 tomorrow and have it work. And if you want evidence in favor of my perspective, note this: despite all of the hoopla in the Democratic Party now about basically the progressive wing of the party resurging, it is remarkable that today the retirement age under Social Security is increasing. No one in the Democratic Party is saying that we're going to stop that. It's the reason that it's increasing is it was put in place in 1983, and we've already done one round. The second round is underway, and the reason no one notices is it's really slow and gradual. So if you put in place things that are backloaded, they take effect very slowly and gradually instead of with a dramatic impact. I think it's the record is actually more promising than other examples, more promising than people suggest. But that requires political consensus regarding what you're actually going to do.
Yeah, I'm always a little worried about these things that say it can work and then your example's 25 years old.
But it's working today. My point is we haven't undone it.
I want to support your point.
Okay.
Another thing which isn't well understood is that for all the sins that were committed by the tax cut, it changes the inflation indexing of brackets in a way that will bring in revenue long into the future by increasing the tax bracket slightly less fast than they would have otherwise. So one of the things, I think there's a sense now that, a widespread sense that deficits and debt clearly don't matter politically. There's no political advantage for getting up there and saying we got to do something about our debt. We have to tighten our belt so the next generation will live better. There doesn't seem to be very much financial market pressure. I mean, the 10-year yield is something like 2.7%. There is some sense among some economists that if we're going to have low interest rates for a long time, Olivier Blanchard spoke about this in his presidential address at the American Economic Association. Essentially, if the real interest rate is lower than the real growth rate, you don't have to worry so much about the debt exploding. And we are, after all, we have the reserve currency, and whenever the world gets screwed up, even if we're doing the screwing up, everybody wants to buy our treasuries. The treasury's having very little trouble borrowing money. So, and now we have a new generation of Democrats in the House in particular who say, like, well, if the Republicans aren't going to be fiscally responsible, we're sure as hell not going to do that. This is what's accounting for their attempts to prevent the House from returning to the pay-go rule, where if you cut taxes or increase benefits, you have to pay for them. So that's a long question. Actually, there wasn't a question yet. So two things. One is...
Do you agree?
No, yeah. So do you think we're worrying too little or too much about the long-term debt? And B, how do you think the political consensus will ever get around to doing something if everybody has decided it's really good to deal with a deficit if the other guy's in power?
Well, I think the central message with which, let me just immediately say I agree, of Olivier Blanchard's talk was the cost of debt, the fiscal cost, the economic cost is lower than we thought it was a decade ago. And that's for a whole variety of reasons. So if you were, really concerned about 80% of GDP, debt to GDP ratio, a decade ago, you should be a little bit less concerned or somewhat less concerned today. I think the difficulty becomes there is some point, and Olivier also noted this, there is the potential for some point at which the debt becomes a crisis, a sort of more immediate forcing event through financial markets. And the trouble is no one knows exactly where that is. So is it 100% of GDP? Is it 120% of GDP? And no one can tell you exactly because it depends on investor expectations. So it's not like there's one threshold for every country and every place and every time, because it depends on confidence and investor psychology and what have you. But it's there somewhere. So I think that gives you some sense of the debate, which is the kind of worrywarts say, well, it's out there. We don't want to get anywhere close to that because once you're there, that's really bad. And the opposing folks say, well, we don't know exactly how far that out that is. Maybe it's 150% of GDP. Who knows? Why don't we keep kind of pushing out until we know we're there? Because in the meanwhile, we could be investing in education and new bridges and what have you. And so this brings me back a little bit to what I was saying before, which is I would personally feel a lot more comfortable testing the boundary of where that is if we put in place things like the new indexation of the tax code, the gradual increase in the normal retirement age under Social Security that are backloaded, because I have very little concern that if it turns out we need more fiscal expansion in 20 years, the Congress is going to prove capable of undoing some of the things that we put in place. The real concern is if the opposite turns out to be true and we're on the edge of the precipice and we're falling into the hole, will the Congress be able to act quickly to raise taxes or cut spending if that's what's required? And that, I think, a lot of skepticism about is warranted. So if we sort of put in place a bunch of things that take effect automatically, make the job easier for future Congresses if they find themselves in trouble because they don't have to vote for anything, it just sort of happens automatically. Also, by the way, helps to boost investor confidence because financial markets will attach some probability to those things taking effect and therefore not worry as much about the trajectory that we're on. I think that gives us some scope for more experimentation.
Okay, so just I want to be fair to Olivier Blanchard. So one thing that Olivier said is he's not making the case that we should be running large deficits today at a time of full employment. What he said is the question is how much do we worry about the level of the debt? And secondly, he said we should borrow for public investment if it has a high return, and we should borrow if we have a recession. It's a complicated argument, but that's kind of what I want to ask you about the politics of this. So I can understand why some Democrats say, why should we have to live with pay-go while we're in charge, and then the Republicans don't have to live with pay-go and they're in charge? So the Republicans are in favor of pay-go now that they've cut taxes. And so the polarization is an issue. There is no what the bipartisan fiscal hawk caucus could fit in one stall in the men's room here or the women's room. So, like, how do you see the political? If you believe, as you do, that we ought to take out some insurance, that we ought not to count on being able to borrow forever and ever, how do you see the political dynamics ever getting to that point?
Yeah, I don't.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I mean, eventually, but not in the foreseeable future. I think this is why I come back to, I think the core fiscal problem that we face really is the fact that we are in an era of hyperpolarization. And I should have noted that's another mistake we made. We went in late 2008, early 2009 with the false hope that the stimulus would be bipartisan. In the House, it wasn't. In the Senate, there were, I think, 3 Republican votes for it. But it basically was not. It was not bipartisan. If we had studied the literature on the growing polarization over the previous 2 or 3 decades, we may have come to a different conclusion about the chances that it ever would have been bipartisan. And I think for any future transition team, for the foreseeable future, don't even hold out the hope that it's going to be bipartisan because it is extremely unlikely to be so. And if you get some Votes from the other party, great, but you're going to have to figure out a way in which you don't spend too much time waiting for the other party because they're unlikely to show up.
I just want to mention to people there's a number of seats in the front. If you want to come down this, particularly this side, if you want to sit down, there's room here. Peter, one you mentioned, but I want to just dwell on, because I think another lesson that we should think about is what happens at the state and local level. So my reading of history is that some of the stimulus was undone by the tightening at the state and local level, and you tried to do some of that with the ACA, with the Medicaid and stuff. But in general, how do you think future generations of federal fiscal policymakers should think about what goes on at the state and local level, and how do we prevent them from undoing the effects of stimulus if we have another bad recession?
So first, this was one significant difference between the recession/recovery that we just lived through and most previous cycles, which is the fiscal constraint at the state level was deeper and persisted longer than in previous business cycles. So there was sort of more damage done from a aggregate demand perspective at the state and local level. It was the motivation behind the state fiscal relief in the stimulus, which I already mentioned we would have loved to have larger, but we thought we maxed out how much we could get done. And that's because, as most people know, every state except Vermont has some sort of balanced budget requirement. So you go into a downturn, and the state and local side of things is going to be directly counterproductive, because in the middle of that downturn, states are going to be raising taxes, not cutting them, and they're going to be cutting spending, not increasing spending, in order to meet this balanced budget requirement at the state level. The best possible thing that could happen is state constitutions and rules change to waive many of those rules. That's probably not going to happen.
They don't even increase capital spending, which is not covered by the balanced budget thing.
Exactly. The question becomes whether, because the budgeting has some kind of crossover and is part of the overall context, whether it would be just net different if the balanced budget rules on the operating side didn't exist. But I agree with you that even there's very little attempt to get around the rules. Let's put it that way. Right. Some attempt, but not that much. So this brings up the obvious point, which is one particularly helpful form of automatic stabilizer is whatever we can do at the federal level to help offset that drain at the state and local level. And the most natural thing that we could have done in terms of the auto stabilizers in the stimulus would be to make the FMAP, the part of Medicaid that the federal government pays for, and that was in the stimulus as a form of support for state governments, have that persist as long as the unemployment rate had been above X.
Let me ask you one philosophical question before we turn to the audience. While I'm not sympathetic to the view that somehow every mistake that you made and your colleagues made brought us Donald Trump, I do think that there's reason to believe that the experience of the global financial crisis, the difficulty getting out of it, the concerns that Wall Street got bailed out and Main Street didn't, and so forth, have undermined public confidence in not only in the government, but actually in our entire economic system. That, as someone mentioned to me earlier, for a number of younger Americans, they see capitalism, not communism, as the false god. And I just wonder how this looks to you, and when you think about your kids and my kids and their impatience with, like, how did you guys screw this up, and isn't the system fundamentally flawed? How do you think about that? I mean, you're a practicing card-carrying capitalist. How do you think about that? Do they have a point? And how do we talk to them about that, the people who are skeptical?
So I think what happened in 2008, 2009 exacerbated but did not cause that anger, frustration. And instead, that's being driven by the fact that for a lot of people, they don't think the system is delivering on their expectations. That was true to some degree. That was true before, it's true after, and it was exacerbated by the fact that there was a spectacular blowout on economic performance with a massive crisis and an intervention that seemed like it was skewed or unfair or what have you. But the core problem is that for too many Americans and frankly too many people across the industrialized world, they don't feel like the current structure is delivering on the hopes and expectations that they had. So the summary statistic for that in the United States is that life expectancy, actually even on average now, is flat to down, but for a long time on average was going up, but it was declining for a very substantial share of especially lower and middle income and especially white Americans. And that is where a lot of the frustration with the current system resides. And you're right that it was exacerbated by the fact that there were a lot of unpopular things that were done in response to the crisis. The alternative of having the crisis go on and on and on, I think, would have also created a lot of anger. And it is true that if you had sort of channeled that a little bit and found some, spectacular scapegoats and made sure people were seen as paying the price, it may have helped a little, but on the anger front. But I think fundamentally the problem really is economic performance for low and middle income people has not been what they want it to be, and then that was made worse by this downturn.
So can capitalism, American style, be modified to deliver rising living standards for the vast majority of people? If so, how?
You have now asked, I think, the core question facing the country, which is also driving a lot of that polarization. I don't know is the honest answer. I wish I could kind of give you a snappy, of course we can, we just need to do X, Y, or Z. But I would suggest the following. I think too much of the policy interventions that are aimed at trying to, quote, fix this problem go back to an Econ 101 perspective, that what we need to do is that what determines the course of your life is, the tax regime, your education, and what have you, as if we're all little islands and all that matters is the incentives that we face and the human capital that we have. And I think what research has shown over the past 20 years is your location matters, the firm you work for matters a lot. So the place-based stuff, as opposed to the people-based stuff, I think the weight of the evidence in my mind is shifting dramatically towards what makes good firms. Because if you work at a good firm, your trajectory, even for the same education, the same tax rate, the same this, that, dramatically different. If you live in a city that's thriving, your trajectory is dramatically different than someone who's otherwise similar living in rural America. So how do we make firms and places thrive? Because I think that will cause people to thrive, instead of thinking the way most policy discussions historically have is, let's get everyone to thrive and then the city or the location will do just fine because everyone's doing great who lives there.
Great. So we're going to take a few questions. I think there's someone with a mic. So I have a favor to ask. Tell us who you are. Gentleman right here on the aisle. Tell us who you are, and remember that a question ends with a question mark. Yeah, give it to him. We'll take two or three, and then Peter can pick which ones he wants to answer.
My name is Edward Weiler, and I'm a retired civil servant with the Environmental Protection Agency. But I wanted to ask, we had a brief discussion about states. And look at something like a trade publication like Bond Buyer, and there's always this great concern about the pension overhang there, that it's sort of this iceberg, this glacier moving.
Right.
And more states are getting threatened to go over the cliff. From where you sit, do you see that as having rising to significant macro implications going forward?
Okay, and gentleman behind him, Bert Ely.
Thank you, Bert Ely, a banking consultant. In the discussion of leading up to the factors leading up to the last crisis and looking ahead to the next crisis, I didn't hear anything about international complications. And particularly, as you know, there's growing concern about what might happen in China if there's a significant slowdown or we have significant global effects from the president's tariff war. So how can the United States respond to that type of crisis where much of the causative factors driving the crisis are coming from outside the United States?
Right. Okay. Is there one more? Chris here in the front. Wait for the mic because people.
Hi, Chris Smith, former Treasury, Miller Center, even alum. You're talking about the response a lot to the crisis. Could you talk a little bit about what did we miss going in 06 to 08? How could we have done better?
Great. So 3 good questions. You can take them in any order you want.
Sure, I'll go in the order that they were delivered. So first on pensions, it's not just pensions, but retiree health care in particular that is causing a lot of unfunded liabilities for state governments. Their responsibility in terms of funding those obligations varies dramatically across states, with some very well-known bad actors that are in more trouble than others. So I think you are correct to worry about it. It's not a now crisis, it's a kind of, the next 10 to 20 years type of situation, but it will vary a lot across states, and you'll see the states that have behaved more responsibly just in fundamentally better position than a few outliers in particular that, just have dramatically larger obligations. But that is an issue. It's not anything that I think is going to, explode tomorrow, but over time, it's very simple. Either state taxpayers are going to pay for it, or the retirees are going to pay for it, or somehow the federal government's going to step in, which I'm more skeptical about. So on the international nature of the next crisis, look, a lot of times it doesn't almost matter where the crisis starts. The fact that the crisis started in the United States last time doesn't really affect the point that it then infected a lot of European countries in the same way, and others in the same way that would have occurred even if the crisis started with them. So I agree with you that the world is, the global economy is global now, but I don't know that fundamentally shifts how we should think about the response, other than the following point, which is one of the reasons why you don't want to become a pariah in international affairs is a coordinated response to a crisis is much more powerful than an uncoordinated one. And if you go your own way during good times, it's not clear that during bad times people are going to be all that swayed by what you think should happen. So there's another cost here to kind of thumping our chest and behaving the way that we have been internationally, which is it's probably going to be more difficult during the next crisis to have a concerted response across the major economies of the world. And I think that is another risk factor beyond the ones that David already suggested. In terms of what we missed, look, there should be a massive amount of humility in the macroeconomic field with regard to projecting when we're about to hit trouble. If you look back at the quotations, even during the summer of 2008, many of which now, as David already suggested, there's been a fair amount of revisionist history around, but they're there in the public domain, so you can check yourself. There was a significant discounting of the chances that this would be severe or bad or really problematic. And so I think the biggest lesson is do not put too much emphasis on especially the point estimates of these kind of economic forecasts, and humility and always thinking about what could the downside look like at any point in time is really important. That is particularly the case today because there are some well-known risk factors that we seem to be just looking the other way about. And one that David and I discussed and that Janet Yellen has really highlighted involves the leveraged loan market and the high-yield debt market, both of which were running $70 to $100 billion a month for a couple years. The interest rates on the loans were really low. And most importantly, the covenants that are typically attached to leverage lending were being waived. So it's almost like you could look back, the volumes are exploding, the rates being charged are very low, and the share of new lending that is cov light, that is without the kind of you must do X, Y, and Z in order to receive this money, reach something like 85%. So it's entirely possible that someone's going to look back, like we look back today, and say, how could you possibly have not noticed that the housing market was about to implode? Just look at these things. That was not going to end well. You look at a lot of the charts on the leveraged loan market in particular over the past 5 years, it is very easy to look at them today and say, this is not going to end well.
Time for a couple more. Is a gentleman here on the aisle?
Thank you. Sandy Afgar, CSIS. What's the role of the ballooning defense budget in either averting the next crisis or promoting it?
Thank you. Gentleman on the aisle here? Oh, one over here. Take one over here. Yeah. Sir, the guy with the mic. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. There's a guy on the aisle here. So why don't we do this one and this one?
Ardavan Mobasheri, I'm former chief economist at AIG. Just to your comment with respect to what did we miss in terms of the leveraged loans, do you think the stress scenarios that we're doing at the Fed and the fragility of the financial system, at the end of the day, we learned it very well at my former employer, at the end of the day, everything about a financial institution is confidence. Doesn't matter how many buildings, how many assets you have. Once confidence is gone, a financial institution is gone. And so do you think that we're stress testing the banks enough, given what you just commented about the leveraged loan market? Are we stress testing them enough from a modeling perspective to say once confidence is gone, it's gone?
Okay. Sir?
I'm John Sanders. I'm a consultant here in Washington specializing in business valuation, and also have a question that's an extension on the what did we miss. In my mind, the crisis, there was really a systemic failure in that as the banks started to melt down, we counted on
Is that mic on?
We counted on I'm sorry?
Just hold the mic a little closer.
We counted on regulators to monitor the situation to a lesser degree. Wall Street analysts were supposedly following banks really closely, should have identified these things, and it was completely missed. So the question is now systemically, have there been any reforms? Should we feel any more confident that there are institutions and systems and protocols in place to identify things like that, or are we just as vulnerable as we were back then? I know there's huge student debt and auto debt.
Okay, perfect. So on defense spending, and this may be surprising from a former OMB director, but I almost tilt another direction. You may have read the recent report that it basically suggests that because of the various constraints that we've put in place starting in 2011-12 on both non-defense discretionary and defense discretionary, there is a question about our at least relative readiness compared to many of the other threats that are out there. So defense spending is clearly one component of the budget. I'm increasingly of the view that if anything, we may need more rather than less over the next 5 or 10 years. But that's a much deeper and more complex question. And in any case, it's not the main driver, as is well known. The main driver of the budget dynamic over the medium to long term involves healthcare in particular, a little bit of Social Security, and the discretionary stuff is there, but it's smaller. And then I'm going to combine the other two. First, I wouldn't put excessive trust in external organizations. They should be an input, but not taken as the all-knowing, all-being perfection of knowledge, because you're right that we learned that a lot of esteemed institutions did not live up to their billing, and we continue to learn that a lot of esteemed institutions don't live up to their billing. But that brings me to the other point, which is it's not just confidence, it's also leverage that matters a lot, because the cushion that you have when the confidence goes depends a lot on your leverage ratio. And so I think the most auspicious development over the past decade has been financial institutions in particular are dramatically better capitalized than they were in 2006 or 7. And we should continue to focus on that as being the best insurance, as opposed to what an external rating agency or what have you says about them. And you're right that any stress test always has model risk and a whole variety of other things. But I come back to basically the more capital that financial institutions have, the safer they are, period.
I think I'm reminded of something Christine Lagarde said in response to a question like that. Safer, but not safe enough. With that, please join me in thanking Peter for his time and his candor.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.